Hello, my name is Mark, and I am making this video as part of a project in my special education language and literacy development course at Illinois State University. Go Redbirds. This video is meant to act as a professional development session on the 5 constructs of language for teachers, both general education and special education teachers who may not know what the 5 constructs of language are and how they affect their students. So what are the 5 constructs of language? They are, quite simply, the rules that govern how language is written, read, spoken, and understood. You will encounter these every single day without even trying. Probably the very first thing you say or read or write will involve you either applying these constructs or observing them. And so because of that, if learners, students have difficulties with language, generally you can pin it down to being relevant to one of these 5 areas. So let's start talking about them. First up is phonology. Now, phonology is the production and understanding of sounds, and those are the 2 big areas for it. They are comprehension of words that are spoken to you, and production, which is combining letters and phonemes to make sounds. Phonemes are the smallest unit of language that can produce sound. So, for example, cat has 3 k, a, t. Don't confuse them with syllables. That's different. Don't confuse syllables with morphemes either. We'll get to that in a second. Some difficulties that a student might have related to the phonology area would be, firstly, if, for example, they have a traumatic brain injury, they might have damage to 2 areas of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, that deal with language, production, and comprehension, respectively. Broca's deals with production, Wernicke's deals with comprehension. And so if there's damage to those areas, either one or maybe even both, then the student would have difficulty from a physiological perspective with those sorts of things. Additionally, if a student is English language learner, for example, if they're from a Spanish-speaking country or from any other country that English is not the primary language, or even some countries where English has a very different accent than the area that you are from, they might have difficulties recognizing how certain letter combinations make certain sounds. For example, in Spanish, the word mañana has an N with a tilde on it. Tilde is a little squiggly line, and that means it has kind of a Y sound to it. It's mañana, not manana. It doesn't sound like banana, even though it's spelled almost the same. And it's something we don't have in English. And so some students might be confused on which N's are supposed to be hard N's or the Spanish N, which has a Y on it. They might also have other troubles related to hearing or speaking, speech impediment, a hearing impairment, which would make even just hearing the things, not even comprehending them, just physically hearing them, very difficult. So some things that teachers can do to help students who suffer from various difficulties, it's going to vary a little bit based on each student, but a good one to start off with is to make sure that your students understand the relation between printed words and letters in English and what they sound like. So going over that CH makes a ch sound, and SH makes a sh sound, and TH makes a th sound. That's going to have a lot to do with memorizing vocabulary, but it can also be done through various sound games and stuff. Songs are a good way to do it because songs rely very much on rhyming. Going on to the next one, we have morphology. Now, morphology is a study of word formation. It involves use of morphemes, which are the smallest unit of language that conveys meaning. You combine those together to create words. So, for example, morphemes can be either a single word, like cat, or they can be a prefix or a suffix that modify the meaning. So if I take cat and an S on the end of it, it becomes cats, and it has a different meaning because it's multiple cats now. Or I can add an S on the front of that, and it becomes scats, which is vocal jazz. and that has a completely different meaning. Some difficulties that a learner might have due to morphology would be understanding of word formation. So, for example, in Spanish, they have a completely different set of rules for how you conjugate verbs, how you modify adjectives, that sort of thing. Very, very different from the way Americans do it, or English speakers do it. So coming from a Spanish-speaking country, they have to completely relearn how verbs and adverbs and adjectives are related into their sentence. Another one would be the meaning behind different suffixes and prefixes. That's knowing and understanding that you add an S onto the end to make it plural and not when to add ES and not adding an apostrophe S because that's possessive. That's something you see beginning learners, young students do a lot, is when they're first learning to speak, they might add S's onto the things that they want to make plural because they're just sort of over-applying that rule. There's a whole another thing you can go into about, developing learners. So things you can do in order to assist students with that is really teach those suffixes and prefixes. Those are big ones because the rules behind them are some of the trickier things about learning English, about how you conjugate certain verbs. I know when I was learning Spanish, the conjugation was the hardest thing for me. I can only imagine how much harder it is in English when there are like 20 more rules, and a lot of those rules are individual. So that's a big thing. Just go over how to conjugate, how those rules apply. Moving on to the next one is semantics. Now, semantics is concerned with meaning, specifically the meaning of words and sentences. It's highly related to morphology in the sense that morphemes cause words to have different meaning. For example, like we said, cat, cats. Meaning has totally changed. And so when I say cats, you know that I'm talking about multiple four-legged furry felines, and not, any other million other things in the world. Difficulties a learner might have with this include memorizing the meaning of words. For example, words they're unfamiliar with, they may not know. When they come across a word in a reading for the first time, they may have no idea what it is because they've never heard it before. Semantics also has to deal with understanding sentences as a whole. So, for example, when I say the cats are on the roof, you know that the cats are up on a roof. Another difficulty is sort of the understanding the guesswork that goes along with the sentence. So when I say the cats are on the roof, you don't know which roof I mean. I don't tell you anything about the roof. I don't tell you anything about the cats, except that they're up on a roof somewhere. And that might confuse some students. Additionally, the more complex sentences get, the harder it is to sort of work out the meaning. Most of my college textbooks have sentences that use a large amount of education jargon. They are very complexly constructed. They are sometimes, seems like too long. It's not simple subject, verb, object. It's very complex sentences. So something you can do for students who are having difficulties in these areas would be to first focus on vocabulary a lot, understanding what words mean, what they look like, how they're spelled is very helpful to students when they're trying to lock down meaning. Another thing is to go over, you can use visual representations of sentences to help students understand what an entire sentence means. Sort of how to take a sentence and create meaning in your head. That works best for physical things like the cats are on the roof. It's a little bit harder for things that don't necessarily have a physical component. So the next one is pragmatics. And pragmatics is how language is used in a social setting. It's the rules that govern how you use language, how you talk to people, why you say hello, why you say goodbye, how you address people, whether it be Mr., Mrs., Doctor, Professor, how you generally speak to someone. So, for example, I will not be using foul language while around my professors or in a student setting, just because it's a violation of the general rules of conduct of how those things are supposed to go. It involves the practice of code switching, which is changing the way you talk based on the group of people that you're around. So, for example, I may not use foul language around my professors, around my student peers while we're at school or while I'm in the classroom, but when I'm alone, or with friends, I'm a little less restricted in the kind of language I'm allowed to use. Difficulties learners might have related to grammatics include using language appropriately. This is a big one, especially for students who may have a emotional or behavioral disorder. They generally like to express themselves, especially their anger, a lot, and they don't always do it in the most appropriate way. They tend to repeat a lot of words they might have heard that are not appropriate in school. This also has to do with knowing when or when not to code switch. For example, from student who emigrated to America from, say, Latin America. They may still speak Spanish at home because it's the language their parents know is best, or their parents want to preserve that culture, and that's incredibly awesome that they are still able to talk in two languages. But if they accidentally walk into school one day and the school is English speaking and teachers speak Spanish and they start speaking Spanish to them, it's not going to help either of them. Teachers not going to understand them. They're not going to get their point across. So they need to remember when to switch to English, when to switch into Spanish, when to switch from slang that you use with your friends to addressing a teacher or professor in an appropriate manner. So what you can do as a teacher for this one is related more to sort of social etiquette and proper behavior management. You want to really stress with your students what kind of language is appropriate in your classroom, what kind of language is appropriate in, say, their home, with their friends, out in public, and reinforcing those rules that govern when you can and cannot say certain things. And finally, we have syntax. Syntax is really focused on grammar. It is the grammatical arrangement of words in a sentence. This is one that is very, very much focused on grammar. So English has a certain word order that's followed. Generally, a basic sentence has subject, verb, and object. And then you can also add in adjectives and adverbs in their correct spaces. And this sentence structure is governed by all the rules of syntax. This ties back into semantics because a person's understanding of a sentence is very much reliant upon it being in the correct order. Again, going back to our example, the cats are on the roof. If I said, on roof cats, it's hard to piece the meaning together. You probably could based on the words you know, but you have to do an extra set of rearranging them into the right order. So difficulties a student might have related to syntax generally have to do with grammar itself, following the various rules of grammar, when to use prepositions, when to use adjectives, when to use adverbs, just the arrangement of sentences, or if you're doing a simple subject, verb, object, that's not as difficult because you only need 3 words minimum. But if you're also trying to put in multiple objects or multiple subjects or adjectives or adverbs or pronouns or what have you, that exponentially increases the difficulty of creating the sentence. Something that people without any sort of impairment or difficulties do every single day because we learned when we were 5. But for other people and other students, it's a lot more difficult. It's also very difficult for students who speak different languages. For example, Spanish has very different rules for when adjectives and adverbs are placed. Generally, adjectives are placed after the object as opposed to before, which is usual in English. So, for example, when I say the cats are on the tin roof, tin is modifying roof. However, in Spanish, it would be more like the cats are on the roof tin, and the adjective tin comes afterwards. So the basic thing to help students with syntax is to just go over those grammatical rules and really reinforce how sentence structure works. A good way to do this is having pre-made matching sections where a student is given subject, a verb, and an object, and all the sentences and all the words that could fit in there, and having to match and create these things using the parts so they understand the order of the parts and are allowed to play with various words that fit in those things. So I hope this has helped you learn a little bit more about the 5 constructs of language. This is a very short video. This isn't a full professional development session. However, there's tons of great resources online for you to learn about this. Go and search them out. Just type in 5 constructs of language and you'll 5 constructs or 5 components of language, and you'll generally find them pretty easy. So I hope this helps you and helps your students. Goodbye.